Hi, my name is Ariane Etahadieh. I'm a third-year student at Queen's University, and this summer I am working at the Georgeville Historical Society, and I've been involved in various projects. Some of these include digitizing the Society's archives, writing and conducting a historical walking ghost tour for the village camp, and managing the Society's Facebook page. Another project I am working on is recording the oral histories of the village so they can be preserved and remembered for years to come. And so with that being said, I would like to introduce to you guys Maureen Cameron, who has kindly agreed to sit down with me today. Maureen has been an active board member at the Georgeville Historical Society for many years and has spent a good portion of her life in the village. This means Maureen has a fountain of knowledge surrounding the history of this village, and so I feel very lucky to sit down with her today to talk about another significant member in this village, and that would be her mother, Adelaide Atkin, who is known for writing wonderful stories in connection to the Eastern Townships and Georgeville. Hi Maureen, how are you?
Good, thanks Ariane.
Thanks for taking the time to be with me here today. I think we can both agree that your mom, Addie Atkin, was a wonderful and significant member within the Georgeville community. So before we jump into things, can you tell me a bit about the importance behind the location of which this interview is being filmed, as well as your mother?
Yes. Well, I'm sitting here at the house that belonged to my mother's parents, Urban and Kitty Hand. And I think that this is an appropriate place to tell you about Adelaide. And in behind us, I think you can probably see, are what's left of a group of trees that were called six birches, and the house's official name is Six Birches. Over the many years since the 1930s, it's dwindled down to just a few branches, but it's still the Six Birches. Now, my mother, Adelaide Kathleen Hand Atkin, was born in 1917 and lived in this village practically all of her life and died at the age of 101. And she was a vibrant thread in the tapestry that makes up our village. The Atkin house in the village was very much like Grand Central Station when we were growing up. People came in the front door and had coffee and chat and went out the back door, or people came in the back door and sat in the kitchen and had coffee and chat and went out the front door. And there was her kitchen, Addie's kitchen was always busy and seldom went a day without a visitor. Mum also liked to write, and when we were little kids, she wrote children's stories for us. And on Sunday morning, my brother Chuck, my sister Nancy, and I would crawl into her bed and listen to the story of the week. They were often based on conversations or experiences that we had had during the week. Our grandfather, George Atkin, lived with us, and he was a vivid character in many of them. She also wrote a weekly column for the Stanstead Journal and sometimes articles for the Sherbrooke Record. When something interesting happened in the village or nearby, she took notes. So the four pieces that I'm going to read will be a good example. The first story that I'm going to read is an example of the stories that Mother used to write for us as children. It's called Copsewood Tales for Children, Chief Owl, by Adelaide Atkin, and it's circa 1950. Grandfather and Copsewood, my mother always, when she was writing stories for kids, she always called it Copsewood instead of Georgeville, and obviously for Cop. Grandfather, do you think the Indians really camped where the village is? Chuck asked. Well, I like to think they did, replied his grandfather. My grandparents told me that Wigwam Point was an Indian campsite. Perhaps the chief was a prince, and the princess were there, sighed Noreen as she sat down beside her brother on the steps. I wish I could find some arrowheads or something. I wonder, Chuck said dreamily, just what the Indians would do if they came back and found us white people living here. Laddie, said the old grandfather, they'd be as mad as hornets. Hearing this, the children started to laugh. What are you laughing at? The old man asked. Oh, grandfather, Noreen said, you're funny. You tell us that the Indians would be as mad as hornets, and here you are, mad as hornets at the new road they're building. That I am, the old man said. I wonder what my old friend Chief Owl thinks as he watches all the things that happen on the land where once only he and his people and the animals lived. Chief Owl? Who's he? Chuck asked. The only owl I know is the one that I hear hooting in the woods at night. Except for the mountain on the lake with the name's Owl's Head. It's Chief Owl's Head, Grandfather replied. Oh, we don't know that there's a story about the mountain, said Maureen. Please tell us about it. The old man settled back in his rocking chair and said, This is the way it was told to me when I was a boy. Long, long ago, when the red men were in this part of the country, the tribe had a very wise and kind leader who was loved by all. He was their chief for many, many moons, but then one day he became ill. And the medicine man worked over him and did everything that he knew to restore him to good health, but his condition grew worse, and soon all the tribe knew that he was going to die. The chief knew it too, and one night in the wane of the new moon he sent word to all the young warriors to meet in his wigwam. Silently, one by one, they passed before the old chief. And when they were all squatted around him, the chief motioned to his eldest son to help him sit up. And he looked at them all for a moment and then gently said, My children, my spirit is growing weak, and I must leave and go to the wigwam of the great chief to be refreshed. The young braves were very quiet when they heard this, and the old chief, who understood the heaviness in their hearts, continued, When the long winter is past and the song of spring is in the throat of each bird, I will return to my people. And then he said, as his voice grew weaker, Watch for me on the mountain that points up to the sky. That was a long, lonely winter for the tribe, and the young warriors were asked to tell the story of the chief's promise to return over and over again as they sat around the campfires. And at last, when the cold of the winter had vanished and the warmth of spring was felt by all, and the forest animals awakened from their deep sleep and the birds were singing, now was the time for fulfillment of the old chief's promise. One beautiful morning, a big black cloud suddenly appeared in the sky, completely blotting out the sun. And the animals ran to their shelters in the woods, the birds stopped their singing, and there was much whispering among the pine trees. The women and children were afraid, and the men of the tribe didn't know what was going on. It was all so strange. The old chief's eldest son stood up and said, My people, be not afraid. We have waited many moons for the return of our chief. I feel that that time has come. And just as he finished speaking, there was a great burst of thunder, and the top of the mountain seemed to be on fire. Huge rocks tumbled down the mountainside, uprooting trees and causing a landslide that fell into the lake, making great waves to splash against the shore. The people were terrified. And the cloud disappeared as suddenly as it came. The birds were singing, the animals resumed their playing, and the pine trees stood straight and tall in the brilliant sunlight. Suddenly, a great cry went up from the tribe, and there, on the southern side of the mountain, was the kindly profile of Chief Owl watching over his people, just as he had promised. Thank you, Grandfather, the children said. That was a grand story. Next time we go up to the lake, we'll look and see if we can see the old chief, if he's still there. Now this story is called Copsewood Elephant. And again, it's written circa 1950. And I think that this one was written after our previous story. Grandfather, Maureen said, you call Owl's Head Mountain your friend. Chuck and I call the Elephant Mountain our friend. Would you like to hear about him? What's this? Said Grandfather. I thought I was the only storyteller around here, he chuckled. Well, of course I would. The mountain truly does look like an elephant, doesn't it? Asked Chuck. Well, it certainly does, replied Grandfather, particularly when looking across the lake from the village of Copsewood. And like Owl's Head, it's part of the Appalachian mountain range. But that's enough geography. Tell me your story. We like to think that the elephant is a royal elephant, said Maureen. Perhaps he once belonged to a herd of elephants owned by the Maharaja, and he strayed away from the herd and came to the lake. And then he decided to stay and guard the village of Copsewood. And on cold nights he snuggles right up to the big chimney on the White House across the street, said Chuck. He changes in looks from day to day, Maureen cheerily offered. We like to think that all of his outfits are kept in the green barn with the white elephant painted on it, and the little man on the red door looks after him. Now that would be the barn, the red elephant barn, and now it's green, but when this story was written, it was green. Now it's red. I like to see him early in the morning, Chuck said, just as the sun is getting up. Then the elephant looks like a knight in shining golden armor, and sometimes he's pink. Grown-ups laugh at pink elephants, but we've seen our elephant when he was as pink as a worm. When the first snow falls, he looks as if he had on a pair of pajamas that were too small for him, said Chuck. And there are times when he dresses for a masquerade in the misty costume of a dancer, and that makes us laugh because he really isn't very graceful. That old fella seems to have plenty of clothes, said Grandfather. How do you think the little man gets them to him across the lake? Oh, that's easy, said Maureen. He rides over on the back of the eagle. We often see him flying over the mountain. You watch, Grandfather. You'll see him too. I see, said Grandfather, a private plane. Every year, about a month before Christmas, the same thing happens, said Maureen. The little man gives him a huge ball to play with, but it really is the sun, Grandfather, and he tosses it around on his trunk every afternoon for about 3 weeks. Then he gives it back to the little man, who puts it away for another year. We always know that Christmas is not far away when we see that. And on Christmas Day, he wears the grandest costume of all, Noreen continued. That day, he wears a blue velvet suit with ermine trimming on the collar, and on his head is a crown of jewels. We can see the jewels sparkling in the sunlight. We know a man who gave the elephant to his wife on her birthday, said Chuck. What did you say? Asked Grandfather, scarcely believing his ears. It's true, Grandfather, said Noreen. I think it's the nicest gift in the whole world. Oh, but how could he do that? Grandfather asked. He bought a hillside, and from there is a view of the elephant, explained Chuck. And there's just enough of the lake showing so it looks as if the elephant had a basin of drinking water beside him. I must say I'm going to have to look more closely at that old elephant from now on, said Grandfather. Sometimes he can't be seen, said Noreen. He grows tired of being watched all the time, and he has the little man draw the curtain so that we don't see him for a few hours. But he always comes back, said Chuck, with more surprises for us. The end. Now, this was taken from some notes that my mother had written down, and she had sent them to Dr. R.H.L. Slater, who I guess wasn't feeling very well, and this is the way that it showed up in a notebook. Dear Robert, I'd love to drop in for a chat, but I'd only add to your misery as I'm recovering from a bout of the flu. So here is a fantasy to make you laugh, I hope. So this was a note that was written to Dr. R.H.L. Slater that accompanied the writing by Addie, and it's called Charlie Was a Veteran. And it's a young boy telling the story, but it's based on a true happening in the village. As I was getting over the flu, and I wasn't allowed to go down to the services for the veterans at the cenotaph this year, my mother insisted that I watch it from our bay window, and she brought me cookies and milk to keep me company. It was a miserable day. The sky over the gray church looked like the inside of the pot my mother boils eggs in. I didn't think many veterans would turn out, but cars started parking along the street, and soon a good-sized group of people were collected in our village park, in front of the little stone monument with the names of the men from our community who were killed in 2 wars. The parson, who lives up the street near us, walked by in his long black robes, bareheaded, and that seemed a little strange to me, as he always wore a beret, even when he was pushing a wheelbarrow in his garden. Then along came his wife. Well, actually, she floated by. She wears a long, full black cape, and when the wind blows, it seems like she's a boat in full sail. She was also wearing a beret, but a different style from the one that her husband should have been wearing. She was followed by Duke, their black dog, and they came to a full stop in front of the monument. From my window, I had a good view of the park, and I recognized nearly everyone there. I saw Colonel Stone limping about dramatically on a cane, Captain Hughes with all his medals shining and I presume jangling, walking very tall and straight. There have been other days, other services, when he was limping a bit and a bit wobbly on his feet. Sergeant Archibald, who was president of the local branch, was there and in charge of everything. The school kids were there along with their mums and dads, but as we go by bus to another town to school, there weren't any of our teachers there. Well, they all gathered round. Some visiting veteran played the last post on the bugle, and all was quiet. Goosebumps were playing leapfrog along my arms when suddenly old Charlie, the bloodhound, up the hill started to howl. Now everyone and every dog knows that old Charlie was top dog in the village. He was big and slow, and he couldn't see too good, but what he said to the other dogs was law. I don't know what he said. I can't always understand dog talk, but the dogs knew. And one by one, every dog in the village started gathering in front of Ernie's General Store, which is next to the park. Their ears were up and their tails were twitching. Well, they all had their ears up except Opie, who has one ear that stands up and the other one falls straight down. The service continued. The parson, who by now was wearing a beret, a proper veteran's one, given to him by the president, I suppose, prayed. Everyone tried to keep in tune with the sad hymn. The flag dangled sadly on the flagpole. The village people, the colonel and the captain laid wreaths, and the kids shuffled one by one nervously, trying not to giggle as they dropped their poppies on the ground in front of the monument. Everything seemed to be going on as well as other Remembrance Day services had, and from my window I saw old Charlie loping down the hill. And as I said, he couldn't see too good, but his nose worked, and he could smell excitement, and it was down in the park. One of the group of dogs saw him too and barked, "Attention, here comes old Charlie." And they all stood up, their ears up, except Opie, and their noses were quivering. Old Charlie, with his long ears flapping aimlessly, looked every inch a veteran as he moved along. He halted in front of the dogs and said something that triggered them into action. Aunt Prudence, who was tall and skinny like a telephone pole, was walking sedately back from having placed a wreath in memory of her relative, and she was nearly knocked over by a pack of oncoming dogs led by old Charlie, and they were heading straight for the wreaths that only minutes ago had been laid at the monument. Curiosity was always one of old Charlie's traits. He just had to know what was in that hole surrounded by evergreens and poppies. He headed straight for it, and he came up with the colonel's wreath around his neck. And from then on, as my cousin Jim told me, all hell broke loose. The dogs made off with the wreaths, and those who didn't get one grabbed onto the one hanging from the mouth of the pal next to him. Obi got a mouthful of poppies, and he yelped with pain because some of the pins stuck in his tongue. And the captain tried to run after the dogs, but he ended up just waving his stick and shouting at them, and the colonel yelled several commands which no one paid any attention to. Aunt Prudence, for the moment, stopped cussing the telephone company and cussed the dogs. Even the parson's dog got into the act, and the parson, again bareheaded, and his wife tried in vain to separate their dogs from the vandals in old Charlie's platoon. Once I saw old Charlie's head sticking out from the folds of her cape. The battle was on. I became so excited I nearly choked to death on a piece of cookie, and my Uncle Andrew slapped me on the back so hard I thought he'd broken it. But I guess he saved my life. He missed most of what was going on outside because he'd been busy discussing ecology with my grandfather. And just as I started to choke, he had been telling about a beautiful marble floor he had seen on an outhouse when he was visiting in Cyprus. Women were screaming, "Stop the dogs! Get the police!" forgetting that the police have to come from a town 30 miles away. It was bedlam. Even the flag started waving. No one could do anything with the dogs, and just as one of the counselors was going towards the fire hall for the truck and a hose, Ernie opened his store door and came out with a big box of dog biscuits. He threw some into the scramble of dogs, and one by one they dropped the wreaths and started eating. Old Charlie, chomping away with a wreath around his neck, was quite a sight. I saw something move in one of the trees, and there, watching the performance and out of harm's way, were our 2 black cats. Well, the fun was over. The dogs disappeared. Old Charlie went home, wreath and all. And the veterans and the rest of the people said how terrible it was, and from now on, no dogs would be allowed out during parades and services, just like on garbage day. Some of the wreaths got mended and were put back against the monument, and they didn't look too bad considering that they'd been through, and they always looked kind of droopy in an hour or so after the service anyway. As I listened to what everyone said, I didn't think it was so terrible. After all the soldiers were boys once, and every boy should have a dog for a pal. I bet their spirits grow tired of the same old memorial services, especially as wars and killings are still going on. Perhaps they used a little ESP on the dogs. Who knows? Anyhow, after everyone had gone home, I looked up, and the sun was shining in the gray clouds behind the church steeple. Perhaps my mum will let me out tomorrow. And then this one is taken from another lot of notes from my mother's many notebooks. And it is about a fire in the village, and the date is about April the 11th, 1973. Fire in the village. The sky was clear, but it seemed damp, and I was tired, so I went to bed early. I was awakened by Jack, who said, "Addie, there's a big fire in the village." And the time was 4:30 a.m. I got up and looked out the bedroom window, and there was a fire over in what was the Sanford property, and then it belonged to a Mr. Schooler, and now is owned by Goulding Lambert. And from that time I went to bed, and from the time that I awakened, 12 inches of wet snow had fallen. The power was off, the lights were out, and the raging fire illuminated the village, and it was a weird sight. We dressed. I had on a red nightie, so I put on some ski pants, sweater, toque, and gloves and overshoes and went out. Carmen was up. Jack went around the village in his old truck blowing his horn. I rapped on doors. Ernie the storekeeper didn't waken. Neither did the bachelors. Claude Thayer came walking down the hill from the Woodjet farm, and because he had seen the glow in the sky and came to investigate. By this time, Jack had been stuck in the snow and had to put on chains. Charles Partington, who was recuperating from a gallbladder attack, had arrived. They discovered the building, known as the shack, was burning. The heavy snow had broken a limb from a tree and had pulled ancient electric wires down, which caused a short circuit and then a fire. Partington's phone was in order, so the McTavishes were called. Wayne is the fire chief. He and Lloyd were in Montreal, so Neil came down. I started up the road to ask the Bernays to go look for Elwood Hand, and I stopped on the way to try waken Jean Haig to come and join the activity, and there was no sound from her. She did hear me, but was hesitant to come down. She's just back from 6 months in Spain and still nervous about being alone. Anyhow, Alex Bernay was on his way to the village, and he was awakened by his father Buster, who had seen the glow, and the other men went for Elwood. Alex went to the fire hall to get the truck out. He and Jack took it and went slowly up the hill with the siren protesting all the way. By the time I arrived on the scene, there was Jack and Alex, Ruth and Charles Partington, Orson Wade, Neil McTavish, Ted Smith. Ted is the caretaker, so he had phoned Mr. Lambert in Montreal. Elwood arrived, and so did the rest of the Bernay men and Eric Evans. We watched while the men got the pump and the hoses working. The noise from the propane gas tanks burning was like a roar of a jet engine taking off. I came home. Carmen had the kettle boiling and coffee in the mugs, and while we were drinking, in walked Bev, Kathy, Penny, and their dog Rusty. Jim had come down to help the fire. They didn't have any power or phone, nor did anyone else all day and night. So the Hand family stayed here. We have a gas range, so we were able to cook and have a fire in the Franklin stove. Jack got out the marshmallows for the kids, and they had fun. The next day, Elwood was busy all day checking here and there. The men working in the power lines were exhausted. There were many fires in the trees in the woods. It was quite a time.
Well, thank you, Maureen. I really enjoyed those stories, and I hope the viewers did as well. Adelaide's stories are very unique and charming, and there's no better person than yourself to read them. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with me here today.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. I'd also like to quickly thank Judy Batchelder because this was ultimately her idea to record Adelaide's stories. So thanks, Judy. Bravo, Maureen. And thank you for watching, and bye for now.